5 and more. How many of you feel like you were born inside the church? Okay. Now, I will say that a long time ago, our church went from being one kind of a church to an elder-led, and it wasn't because we wanted people to be the bosses. We just did a study, and this was back in the 1980s, the late 80s, the early 1990s, and they did a study under the pastor that was here at that time, a group of leading men of the church, and they said, you know, the Bible talks about elders, and we don't have any. And they said, well, what is an elder-led congregation? And they went ahead and taught through that, and then the church adopted the elder-led way of doing church life and making church decisions. And we've been operating on that ever since 1989, 1991. And so a few years ago, some things were going through, and we took a look, and there were times when we had a budget, and the budget, we would run out of money in a budgeted line item, and technically either we had to either stop doing anything in that line item or come back to the church and ask to amend the budget. And so we talked with Dr. Bruce Craddock, who was the head of Next Gen, and other people like that, and they said you need to get rid of that kind of a constitution and go to a policies and procedures manual and just have a fluid budget. And we've been operating on a fluid budget. What does that mean? Instead of saying, well, we'll spend this amount of money this year on this, and this amount of money this year on this, and this amount of money, we just went ahead and put together a skeleton of our bills, much like you probably do at your house. Put together a skeleton of our bills, and we said, okay, as the bills come in, we'll pay them. But that has led a lot of people to say, well, but we don't know where the money is going. Is there any way we could have more information? And so next Sunday, how many of us know that next Sunday is going to be our pastor's appreciation, our elders' appreciation Sunday, and immediately after that, the elders are going to present for you a State of the Church address. We're going to show you exactly where all the money that for the last couple of years, how it's come in, where it has all gone, the ministries that we do, and some projected plans. Reintroduce you to all of our missionaries. All the program leaders are going to say a word or two about the different programs that go on here. So we'll have a luncheon. Right after the luncheon, we're going to have a State of the Church address. Now, we are not going to vote in a budget. We are not going to vote in officers. All of that takes care of itself on an ongoing basis. But the elders want you to know what's going on. How do we do it? Pastor Darrell will be talking about the finances. Dave will be talking about the music ministry and the video ministries. I think Ann will share a little bit about the women's ministries. Margaret's going to be talking about the children's ministries. I think Matt Rossell is going to be able to show us pictures of all of our missionaries in case we have forgotten who they are, so that we can get reintroduced and how you could stay plugged into them. Now, I will say that Karen does a fabulous job of getting those emails from them and then sending them out to us, but let's just be honest. How many of you get an email that was from someone to somebody else, that was somebody else, and then sent to you, and you go, well, with all the other emails, I don't have time for that, and you don't even look? Wouldn't you like to be able to just email directly to a missionary on the mission field? And maybe take the time to say, you may not know me by name, but I go to Westside and I know we support you. And I just want you, if there's anything you'd ever want me to pray about, you just send me an email. If you want to, call me. Wouldn't you like to have a personal connection, a relationship with each and every one of our missionaries? And so all of that is next Sunday. I am as excited as I could possibly be about that. The only thing I'm more excited about is today's message. Now, how many of us have ever watched our messages on YouTube? Anybody ever watch them? Now, sometimes I hate to ask that because nobody's hand goes up, but I will say anywhere between 20 and 30 people watch every week. And I just found out that one of my friends that I went to seminary with at Moody just found out that we're on television that way by the YouTube. And his mom and dad were part of the adult ministry team that led me to the Lord. And their whole family is going to watch today's message on YouTube. And so we have been trying something, and this is what we've discovered. That if you watch it on YouTube, and if you've watched it, as soon as the slides go up, all of a sudden, whoever the speaker is, when Pastor Darrell, all of a sudden you just see a dark silhouette of a face or a head or somebody just walking around. Anybody know what I'm talking about? So from now on, we're going to try nothing but pure black background slides. And we'll see how it works. Now, next week, we've got a different color. You know, we're trying everything so that when somebody does take the time to actually watch it, they can see it. In fact, I heard one person say that it's the best YouTube video I never saw but enjoyed listening to. Well, we want to do it better than that. Last week, we took a look at faith in the promised land out of Hebrews chapter 11, or 2 weeks ago. Last week, we took a look at faith in the promised son. This week, we want to take a look at Hebrews chapter 11, and I'm going to begin in verse number 13, and this is the title of today's message, These All Died. Now, I told someone earlier today that the title of today's message is, These All Died, and they said, ooh, that's not very encouraging, but let me ask you, if you are going to heaven, how many of you know that the best day of life you will ever have is the day you die? Is the day you die. I'm still not over this surgery that I had 4 weeks ago. And every day around 7 o'clock at night, I hit a wall. Anybody here going to hit a wall at about 7? And about 7 o'clock at night, all of a sudden, my body just starts to hurt. It starts to ache. I can't stay awake. I can't sit up. I can't stand up. I can't lay down. I mean, everything goes just crazy. I mean, all of a sudden something will happen, and I'll say, must be 7 o'clock. And sure enough, plus or minus, it's 7 o'clock. And there will come a day when I will never have another 7 o'clock. Does anybody know what I'm talking about? I will never have another 7 o'clock. Now, what is your best hour of the day? If you were to say, I'm a morning person, or I'm a night person, or I'm a lunchtime person, I'm basically a lunchtime person. My best time of life is between 11 and 2. And I try to work it out that if I do get to go work out, I work out between 11 and 2, because that's when I feel the best. Whatever type of person you are, that's the time it'll feel like in heaven. If you're a morning person, it's going to feel like eternal morning. If you're a night person, you're not going to say, oh, when are we going to get some heavenly night? You'll feel like eternal night. In other words, heaven will be perfect for everybody. Everybody when? All the time, for all time. I can't even wrap my head around that concept, but the Bible says it's true, and so the first thing I have to believe is what? Even though I don't understand it, if God said it, it will be true. And you know what? It's already true. I just haven't experienced it yet. Let's read verses 13, 14, 15, 16. These all died in faith, not having received the things promised, but having seen them and greeted them from afar, and having acknowledged that they were strangers and exiles on the earth. For people who speak thus make it clear that they are seeking a homeland. If they had been thinking of a land from which they had gone out, they would have had opportunity to return. But as it is, they desire a better country, that is, a heavenly one. Therefore, God is not ashamed to be called their God, for he has prepared for them a city. Let's pray together. Father, as we take a look at this passage and as we take a look at our faith, help us to see your faithfulness. Help us to see your graciousness. Help us to see your transference of that grace into actual living grace in us through Jesus Christ. And help us to have a better desire than what we had when we came in. And we pray this in Jesus' name. Amen. Well, the question I have initially is, these all died, and the first question is, who are these? And so let me just say that I believe these are for the people that we have just been reading about. Abraham, Sarai, or Abram at that time, Sarai, and Isaac. It's the man, it's the lady, and it's the promised son. Now, it's a brand new paragraph. So how many of you have a Bible that is written paragraphically? That means you see either there'll be the paragraph symbol, or sometimes they'll actually block it off into paragraphs and then put the verses as they fit in the middle of the paragraph somewhere. Let me just say, I love those Bibles for reading. But when you're teaching out of that, you say, well, take a look there at verse number 14, and it's stuck right in the middle, and you have to go searching for it in the middle of a paragraph. But I love it when they put it in paragraphs, because the original author of the text was God, and God taught in chunks. And so we want to take a look at this chunk that God thought was important to keep together as a literary unit, a unit of teaching. So it begins in verse number 13, goes all the way down to verse number 16. It's a new paragraph. So as far as it's been by faith, everything, so by faith, by faith. So far it's been by faith, by faith, by faith. But take a look at verse number 13. These all died by faith? No, there's a distinct difference. Now all of a sudden, instead of these all died by faith, these all died while they were faithful. They died in their faith. So that means the closer they got to death, the closer and stronger their faith was. Let me just ask, how many of us have dwindled in our faith over the years? But those who truly understand the power, the awesome power and the awesome love of God, we grow in our faith. So by faith we get saved, but we live in our faith and we die in our faith. It says, by faith they lived, and in faith they died. Let's continue. F.F. Bruce, when he's writing on this particular passage, says this. This teaching now is shifting from talking about an individual or individual's example of living by faith to now God's commentary on how all Christian people as a group, especially Abraham, Sarai, and Isaac, how they as a group died in faith. But let me just say, that particular line of reasoning is much debated. If you were to say, all right, let me take a look at 5 different commentaries by 5 different powerful commentary writers and theological thinkers, all the way back to all the people who wrote the 1st, 2nd, 3rd century, all the way up until today, much debate, and much of them are as far as from the east to the west is in how they define it. But I tend to agree with F.F. Bruce, is that God is now shifting, talking about all of these died in their faith. So that gives me an understanding of who all these are. And then also it ends with God saying what? Therefore. Now that word, that therefore, is the word deo. That means because of all this, as a direct result. So we have, they died in their faith, and because they were faithful in life and faithful in their death, therefore we get what God is going to do as a direct result. I'll get to that in a minute. Regardless of how you translate or interpret verses 13, 14, 15, and 16, there are 3 things that are absolutely sure. Number 1, they were still living by faith when they died. I read a story this week about a young woman who came to her church, and she told the people at the church that she didn't even have enough money to pay the rent and could not keep the electric on, could not keep the water on. And so everybody said, we will pray for you. And the pastor called some people up later and he said, you know, the Bible says if anybody comes to us and says they don't have a coat and you have 2, you should give them one. So if somebody who is a church member comes and says they don't have heat and we have heat, we should give them some. So he said, how many of you will do like me and will take up an offering and I'll take it over to her to try to at least get her heat back on and get her water back on? And so they took up an offering. And so later that day he went over to the lady's house and he knocked on the door and there was no answer. And he knocked a little harder and there was no answer. And he says, well, she must have moved out. So later that day he went to the grocery store, and as he was going to the grocery store, he saw her standing in the parking lot. And he said, what happened? Are you living in your car? And she said, no, I'm still at the house. He said, well, I was there earlier and I was knocking. And she said, well, I thought it was the bill collector, so I didn't answer. How many times has God been at your door with exactly what you needed at exactly the time you needed, and you are so afraid and consumed with your circumstances, you didn't answer the door? What did Jesus say? Behold, I stand at the door and beat the door down until you open up. Behold, I stand at the door and I knock. And if what? And if anyone... And so this lady looked at the pastor and he said, well, if you don't believe God can meet your needs, just stop believing. And she said, I can't. He said, exactly. Because those are truly people of faith. You didn't save yourself, God saved you. And you can't unsave yourself either. But we can become unfaithful. So we need to continue to live by faith all the way up until they die. Number 2, they endured in their faith. Because they had seen and embraced God's promises. They had seen and embraced. They are going to embrace something they never get. Now, you know, most of us think in order to embrace something, it's got to be something. Anybody ever try to embrace air? Anybody ever try to embrace air? And yet sometimes God's promises feel like you're embracing air. Like there's nothing there. But if God has said it, we embrace what? Because faith is the assurance of things hoped for, not yet. And without that faithful embrace, it is impossible to do what? To please God. Because those who want to please God have to believe that God is, and that God is what? A rewarder of those who, I'm just going to say it this way, live by faith. Because if we're living by faith, we will diligently seek Him. Number 3 is this one. They confessed that they were strangers and exiles. Ever feel strange? Now, I'm not talking about being a weirdo. You know, there's some weirdos. I'm talking about being strange. You know what that means? Being not unlike everybody else around you. Anybody remember there was an old TV show called The Twilight Zone? Anybody, any old people here? There was a TV show called The Twilight Zone. And this whole episode of The Twilight Zone, there was this lady there, and she was talking about, you know, I'm so hideous looking, I didn't look like anybody else. I had to have this surgery. And the whole episode, anybody remember this one? Was her face wrapped up in these bandages. And all of a sudden, at the very end, the doctor, you just see the doctor's hands, and they cut it up, and they lay it open, and the most beautiful lady's face you have ever seen, and they all went, oh, it didn't work. And the camera panned back, and they were all a bunch of the most hideous-looking people in the world. And she just wanted to look like them. You see, we don't want to look like the sin of the world. We don't want to look like, we should look like strangers and exiles. We ought to look weird, but not be weirdos. We should be strangers and aliens. Do you realize it's almost 500 years after the death of Jacob? We have Abraham, Isaac, Jacob. Right? And 500 years after the death of Jacob, does Israel get any of the promised land as a possession? So here is this promise that he makes to Abraham, and it's 500 years later that the promise actually starts to kick into reality in the human world. Did you know that means that God has a plan for you, and it may take 500 years? But I guarantee you this, if we don't get saved by faith and then live in faith, your children's 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 children may be the recipient of the very thing that you knew God wanted. I really believe that this is not the last building God wants Westside Community Church in. And I have been praying and I have been preaching that in our next building. And it may take 500 more years. But by faith, I can see it today. By faith, I can see it today. Now, why? Is it just so I can say, look at all the land I possess? Is that why God was giving Abraham the promised land? No, so that he could do what? Take the heathen and the sinful activity that dominated that land and turn it into what? A place that was dedicated to the Lord. So instead of dominated by sin, dedicated to the Lord. I still believe that we need more dedicated to the Lord in Los Manos, Dos Palace, Gustine, Newman, Fireball. And as we live and claim and embrace those truths that may not come for 500 more years, you're going to keep hearing me say in our new building, and it may be Virginia's great-great-great-grandkids that see it. But I'm going to tell you, as sure as God is today, I see it. Because I don't believe the best days of my life are behind me, and I don't believe that the best days of this church are behind us either. In verse number 13, notice what it says. These all died in faith. Now, they did not have it, but they saw it and they greeted it from afar. I want to break these words down for you just a little bit. This word here in the Greek that says to see means to obtain a higher knowledge. It means to obtain a higher knowledge, not because you can see it with your eyes, but because you know it in your heart. You know it in your faith. So when it says here, they all died, not having received the things but promised, but they saw it as if it was already there. They saw it. And not only they saw it, but they greeted it. It says they saw these things and greeted them. The word here for greet means anticipate with joy. How many of us are already now excited about Christmas? Or how many of us are going, oh no, Christmas. I'm going to have to do this, I'm going to have to do that, I'm going to have to buy this, I'm going to have to do that, I'm going to. Now, every time you will get depressed is because you've got too many I'm going to's in your mentality. What would we say if God's going to? God's going to. God's going to. You see, you've got limited funds, you've got limited exercise ability, you've got limited amount of faith and limited emotions. God's limitless. We should greet and anticipate with joy. This word here from afar means time and distance. It's not just a distant place. It didn't say that they saw it off in the distance. It means that they saw that it may not have take place for a long time. How many of you know that God does not wear a Rolex? God is not living on 24-hour increments. What time is it in God's realm of existence? It's right now. So is God's world of existence, when did he create the world? Right now. When did Jesus get born in Bethlehem? Right now. When did Jesus die on the cross? Right now. When was the consummation of the ages? I'm saying past tense, because in God's world, it's what? It's already happened, even though in our world, it's what? It's futuristic, but in God's world, it's done deal. It is a done deal. They saw it afar, and literally in the Greek, it means they saw it in a distance and a distant time. That means they didn't say, all right, God, I'll give you 15 minutes. How many of us put God on a timetable? God, if you don't do this by this, if you don't do this by this, if you don't do this by this, then what? What are you going to do? You're going to say, well, then I'm not going to go to church? Who is the only person you have hurt when you do that? We don't hurt God. We just hurt ourselves. 13, they acknowledge. This word here for acknowledge means they adopted the terms of the promise and declared it openly. It says they have seen from afar and have acknowledged. Literally, this is a word that literally means I accept it and I verbally assent to it. How many of us have ever said, somebody's asked us a question and they'll say, do you agree? And you nod your head and they say yes. Say yes. Say yes. Because why? We want to hear not only just that acquiesce of the head, we want to hear what? An affirmation of the voice. And this word here for acknowledge literally means that they accepted the terms of the promise and they declared it openly out loud. Now how do we know that? Look at verse number 14. For people who speak thus. You see, verse number 14 is directly after the word acknowledge. And they having acknowledged for people who speak like this. For people who speak like what? Now we've got to go back to verse number 13. They acknowledge that they don't have just an internal hope, but they have an external witness. And it is both by the words that they say and the deeds that they do. They have verbally, participatorily accepted the program and the promise. Abram, Sarah, they did what? They had gone out. It says that they had gone out. Look at verse number 15. They had gone out. And they could have returned. But instead of returning, they had a higher calling. And so they went ahead and they left where they were. It would be like going from where the people are. I can remember, I so wanted to be a pastor, the real pastor of a real church. I had been in seminary. I had been a mission church pastor. You know what that means? That we just had a group of people coming together for a Bible study. And many times at seminary when people would say, well, I'm the pastor of this church and I'm the pastor of that church. And they would ask me, well, what church do you pastor? And I would say, well, I'm a mission leader at an apartment complex. They'd say, well, tell us when you have a real church. And let me just tell you that not only broke my heart, but eventually it wore me down and I agreed with them in sentiment. That was wrong. But let me just tell you, you tell an eagle it's a chicken long enough, it'll believe it's a chicken. And I just needed to say that I was the pastor of a real established church. And so this church invited us to come as pastor. And to be honest, I didn't really hardly pray about it. I just said, thank you, God. Yay! I can now go and be the pastor of this church. And it was one of the most miserable years of ministry I have ever experienced. I think the people were miserable and I was miserable. Now don't get me wrong, it wasn't always miserable. There was a lot of great things. There was a lot of people got saved. In fact, the church went from about 12 to about 80. And in that town, there was only 100. In fact, people of large churches, I said, how many of you can claim that 80% of your population comes to your church? And the first thing that happens is the one self-appointed deacon started going around to people's houses saying, we don't want you to come back, we don't want you to come back, we don't want you to come back, and chased them all away. And many of them were his relatives. And when I called him on that, I said, He goes, we don't want those deadbeats. They don't give to the offering. And he called his nieces and nephews deadbeats. You see, I went right back to the seminary place. And it's not that I had my eye on going back. I just had my eye on following God. But did you know that sometimes when we follow God this way, but hear me, when we're following our wills this way, don't be surprised if God's got to get us back to here before we can open up our eyes that we should have gone over here in the first place. You might get that one? These people, it says that they had gone out, and they could have returned. But instead of returning, they turned their eyes towards a place they could not see that was not of this world. They continued to, instead of looking out, they continued to look up. That's why Hebrews 12 is going to start off by saying, keep our eyes fixed. Not on this world, but where? Keep our eyes fixed on Jesus Christ, the author and perfecter of our faith. That's what we've got to do. Abraham and Sarah acknowledged and accepted that they were what? That they were Zianos. Now this word Ziano means strangers. And literally in the day of Abraham and Sarah, a stranger were people who were usually hated in that land. They were sort of like being an Alabama fan in Opelika, Alabama. Does that make any sense to anybody? Yesterday, Auburn University beat Alabama University in Opelika. And let me just say, you don't yell Roll Tide in Opelika. And so you're regarded with hate and suspicion. Not only that, you're usually seen with contempt, and you have few, if any, rights or privileges. You cannot own lands, you cannot own a business. You can live there, but you can't be at home there. And so this word, having acknowledged that they were strangers, and you could say, well, look at what they gave up. They didn't give up anything, but they did not try to live up. Now, remember this old phrase that looks something like this? Instead of trying to live up to the Joneses and surpassing the Joneses and moving on to the Nelsons, instead of trying to prove who we are by how we can associate with who we call the movers and shakers, the real mover and shaker is Christ. The only person, and I don't need to impress Christ, I need to embrace Christ, is what we need to do. So in verses 15 and 16, it starts off with an if statement. If they had been. Verse 16 comes to a conclusion. But as it were, but as it is. And so it starts off with on one hand and ends up with on the other hand. And so what is the teaching? And it has this word kai in it that is in the midst of it, but you don't see it. How many of us see in the beginning of verse number 15, if they had been thinking? Anybody have that? But in the Greek, the very first word is but. And the translators don't put it in there. Not one version of the Bible puts it in there. Sometimes they hint at it and says, and if they were thinking. But the first word in the Greek is this word kai. And what does it mean? And it says, and or but if they had been thinking of where they had been, there was plenty of opportunity for them to go back. But what does verse number 16 say? But they weren't thinking about where they left. When the people left Egypt, they consistently thought of what? Egypt. But when Abraham and Sarah left Ur of the Chaldees, you never hear them say, let's go back. You never hear them say, let's go back. They continue to say, we're not there yet. We're not there yet. And did you know, once we get saved, it's so many times people have said, my life just seemed so easy before I got saved. Things are simpler before I got saved. People didn't criticize me for my faith. They didn't call me a hypocrite. They didn't make fun of me before I got saved. We can't look at what people are saying. We've got to be able to look at God and hear Him say into our spirit, well done, good and faithful servant. Keep moving forward. Keep living upward. This word dio is the word therefore there in verse number 16. It says dio, therefore, as a direct result of living by faith and dying in faith, as a direct result. Now I want you to notice this. Even though many times they had failed. If I was to ask you to go back and say, how many times did Abraham fail? How many of us could say, well, he called his wife his sister, but he didn't really like her, she was his half-sister. And he should have been, and he should have been, he should have, and he should have. God told him initially to leave this place and leave all of his family. The first thing he does is brings his father and his uncle and his nephew with him, right? And God still says what? He was faithful. Now, how many of us, when we first get saved, we are still bringing a lot of that sinful baggage along with us. And the closer we get to who our God is, the more that baggage just what? Gets left behind. Few of us can just walk out and leave it all behind. What did Paul say? He says, the very things I want to do, I don't do. The things I don't want to do, I do. Who will save me from me? So even if the Apostle Paul still had some baggage on the other side of salvation, don't be surprised if you do too. But the goal should not be to drag your baggage to the cross. Your goal should be to just consistently be letting it go. Consistently lightening your load on yourself. And notice what it says, therefore, God is not ashamed. Notice what it says. Therefore, God is not ashamed to be called their God. Who am I that you are thinking of? Now, we're going to talk about John 15 in just one second. Abraham, Sarah, Isaac, it says they still is. Now, I'm going to have to conjugate these verbs by Greek grammar, and it goes like this. Therefore, God is not ashamed to say, Abraham is... I is his God. Sarah, I is her God. Isaac, I is, because according in God's world, they didn't die. They were not a was or a were. They still are and is. We still is. Job says this in 19, 25, 26. And he says, and as for me, and this is Job speaking. Job says, and as for me, I know that my Redeemer lives. Now, I want to remind you that Job predates Abraham in historical life. This is before Abraham. Some people say he might have lived at the exact same time. Some people say it could be as much as 100 years prior. So even 100 years possibly before the life of Abraham, we have the life of Job. And Job says, I know that my Redeemer lives. And at the last, he, my Redeemer, will take his stand on earth. There'll be the consummation of the ages. Even after my sin is destroyed. What does that mean? It means after I've been put in a sarcophagus and I've got nothing left but bones, and even my bones may have dried up and turned to dust. Even after my flesh is destroyed, yet out of my flesh, what does that mean? Out of my sarx, out of my spirit. Because even though Job's flesh is gone, his bones are gone, Job is never gone. I shall see God. And the word here for see means I shall always see God. Let's go forward and take a look at what Paul says in Philippians 3, 19 to 20. So that you are no longer strangers and aliens. You think maybe he's thinking about whoever the writer of Hebrews was, or the writer of Hebrews was thinking about this. And you think they're both thinking about maybe Sarah and Abraham in Genesis 17 and 18. And it says, and you are no longer strangers and aliens, but you are fellow citizens. We are going to look strange in the world, but remember, this world is not our home. With the saints and members of the household of God. A lot of people don't like to be called saints. They think that that ought to be for saint this person and saint that person. You know what a saint is? A saint is anyone Jesus Christ has redeemed. With all of our flaws. We are saints. We are saints, and we'll be saints in glory. Paul goes on and says in Colossians 3, 1 through 4, if you have been raised with Christ, seek the things that are above, where Christ is seated at the right hand of God. Set your minds on the things. That means you get saved by faith, live in faith. Set your minds on things that are above, not on the things of this world. For you have died, and your life is hidden with Christ in God. When Christ, who is your life, appears, then you will also appear with him. Why? Because Christ is... My sister died when I was 4 years old. But I will see my sister because Virginia Spann is. And you know, for her, it will be like it was just a second ago. Because a day with the Lord is like 1,000 years, and 1,000 years is like one day. And even though it's been 50 years since I've seen my sister, you know what she's going to say to me on that day? 60 years since I've seen my sister, you know what she's going to say to me? I just got here. I just got here. Let's look at the words of Jesus in John 15. Feel free to look these up. In John 15, 12 through 17, it says, this is my commandment. Now this word here for commandment literally means this. This is my absolute injunction. It is my absolute law. This is my commandment. This is not my suggestion. This is my commandment. This is my absolute injunction. This is my absolute law. Love one another. This is my absolute commandment. Love one another. And there has been no greater love than the person who is willing to lay down his life for his friend. For his friend, for his brethren. Jesus laid down his life. He physically died for us. But he is asking us to lay down our life so we can love. You see, the reason we can't love one another is I'm still holding on to my what? Petty disagreements. You see, Jesus laid down his life and died. Jesus is asking us to lay down our life and love. The unlovable? Absolutely. The person that irritates you? Absolutely. The person that is calling you a liar? Absolutely. We don't just love those who love us. We love because he loved us first. He goes on to say that Jesus said that he does this for his friends. Now this does not mean, hear me, this does not mean that if you will love people, then Jesus will be called your friends. But it does mean this. He says, you will be called my friends if you do this. Now if you do this, he is not saying, if you do this, I'll be called your friends. He is saying this, as we prove that we are his friend by the way we love one another. He is not saying, if you do this, then I'll call you friend. He is saying this, if you do this, it absolutely proves that you are my friend. And if you won't do this, it proves what? That our friendship is precarious at best. Now, I'm not going to say you're not saved, but you know what I'm going to say? You're not sanctified. You're hanging on to baggage. You're just like Sarah and Abram when you still had Terah and Haran, and you're dragging them along to the promised land. Don't drag your baggage into tomorrow. Today is the day to leave it all. We prove that we have because we've heard God's call. We've reflected on God's call. We've answered God's call, and we are dying to ourselves to live to Christ. And what is that? We are laying down our life so that we can love one another. We need these verses today. We need to remember, and all these died in faith. That doesn't mean we should be saying, I hope I die today. You know what that means? We're saying is, I pray that I'll be faithful till that day comes. I pray that I'll be faithful. Thanksgiving is over. Christmas is coming. And the questions I want to ask, it's right on the bottom of your page. If you took a preparation or a sermon handout, it says, is Jesus my greatest gift? Not just this Christmas, but is he really my greatest gift? Is Jesus my greatest gift? Is Jesus as my friend my greatest desire? Is Jesus as my friend my greatest desire? Is Jesus going to be, is Jesus going to be the center of my Christmas plans? Is Jesus going to be the center of my Christmas plans? Now, the one thing I do know, he wants to be. He wants to be all of this and more. 1 Samuel, verse 2, verse 30 says this. Those who honor me, and this is God talking. God says this, those who honor me, I will. These all live by faith, and God was not ashamed to do what? To be called what? Their God. Because those who honor me, that doesn't mean you never mess up. It just means you continue to honor him. Even when you mess up, you say, Lord, I'm good. Lord, I've still got baggage. Lord, I've got to confess. And God is going to say this, you're not home yet. But you don't need to be carrying all that garbage around either. These all died in faith. God was not ashamed to say, I am their God. And John MacArthur says this in his closing of his commentary on chapter 11. It says this, nothing is more honoring to God. Now catch this. Nothing is more honoring to God as a life of faith. And then he makes one more statement. I want you to really, really think about this. He says this, in fact, nothing honor him but faith. Because without faith it is what? Impossible to please God. Oh come, let us adore him. We go Christmas next week. Let's pray. Father, as we take another long thought about what we've been hearing, just a couple of verses, but could be preached on for weeks and weeks. Lord, help us to not just go back to try to remember every point, but dear Heavenly Father, individually, I know that you can send the Holy Spirit into every single person's life and bring out some one thing that you will impress upon each and every one of us. It'll be different. It might not even be anything I said, but something they heard directly from you in their spirit. Whether it be about living by faith, whether it be by living in faith, whether it be about hanging on to baggage, whether it be about surrendering our life so we can love, whether it be about the fact that we've got to confess that we're aliens and we don't belong to this world, whether we're looking around at the accolades other people get and allowing it to dictate my emotions because I didn't get it. Help us to continue to hear again, we're not home yet. And help us keep our eyes focused and fixed on Jesus Christ. And it's in his name that we pray.